They say they're being descriptive. This is what a woman is, but they're only prescribing what they want that word to mean, or what they want people to mean when they say those words. They're never actually engaging in any sort of semantics or linguistics when they have these arguments. They are only saying, this is politically what I want it to mean, or because of some sort of outcome, I want it to mean this. And generally, I don't engage in that because I'm trying to focus just on what the word means so that people have at least a starting point so that they all have like an understanding and can move on from there. So if there is a prescriptive, like I said, I don't know that I've actually thought that much about that part of it. And yeah, I'm interested to hear what your prescription is in this case, because I would assume that would lead us to what is or is not transphobic.
So I guess we're here to talk about language, gender.
Yes, gender inclusive language. I'm going to give everybody a little quick intro. This isn't so much like the panel, so you guys can introduce yourself and stuff. But I will start with me. I am Chaeiry. I'm hosting this conversation between Dr. Avi and Tom. That was actually supposed to happen in a different direction. It was supposed to be Tom moderating for me and Dr. Avi, and then I stopped debating. And now I'm taking the moderation role. And I'm probably still going to insert my concerns or my questions about the things that I think into the conversation. But I was intrigued in hearing that Dr. Avi didn't think he agreed with Tom entirely. So they might have a few things to talk through. I don't think it'll be a heated debate, but probably a really good conversation. So I'm going to start with Dr. Avi to introduce himself.
Well, just to clear, I have no idea if I agree with Tom at all.
Okay.
I haven't met him before, but we'll see. We'll get to we'll explicate it. For those who don't know, I'm Avi. I'm a doctor. I have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/AviMD. I do all sorts of various discussions and debates on all sorts of topics. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Tom?
Yeah, my name's Tom. I go by Tomfoolery Show on YouTube. Yeah, I also don't know how much we agree or disagree. I'm interested to get into this. I've written a document on gender that's been highly debated across a bunch of channels and contested a lot. And so I have like a high interest in the way that we use language when it comes to gender, but maybe haven't thought out the moral prescriptions on transphobia as much. So I think this is going to be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, sure. So I guess one of us can start with our general takeaway on this. It doesn't really matter who it is. If you prefer, that's fine, or I can just give my general take.
Mm-hmm.
And
let's start with Dr. Avi.
Yeah, sure. So my general take is actually fairly, well, I was going to say fairly simple, but the topic gender inclusive language may seem like a simple topic, but I think there's a lot of topics within that, and I think a lot of people talk past each other because they conflate, either for conflating different questions or if it's the same question, conflating different semantic usages where there's no propositional dispute, that is to say that there is no disagreement on the concept either one is invoking, but rather there's a difference in values over what words should mean. Some should mean a certain thing that another person is using in a different way. That is to say that there is a value that this person does not use this given semantics. But other than that, I think so a lot of the debate is really not a debate. It's really just people talking past each other. So, for example, if we ask the question, are trans woman, I think that's going to trivially depend on what we mean by woman and what we mean by trans woman. There are certain usages that people invoke where it's trivially true. There are certain usages where people invoke that it's trivially false. So that really just depends on just unpacking the semantics. And then there's a separate question of, well, yes, that might be the case. It might be trivially true or trivially false, depending on what semantics we use, but ought we use it? What should we use in our semantics? Should we use a semantics in which it's trivially true, or should we use a semantics in which is trivially false? And I want to highlight that that's a very different question. than the simple question of whether it's true or false. So there's a difference between whether it's true or false and whether we should use or adopt a semantic by which it's true or false. And I think a lot of people don't even get to the second part. A lot of people just start off with the first part and say, oh, well, trans women are women, or, oh, what do you mean? Women, clearly trans women are not women. Well, by women, I mean this, or no, but it's clearly this other thing. In fact, they usually don't even get to that part. They usually don't even see that they're using the terms differently. Or they try to invoke some sort of linguistic prescriptivism by which there's one true one true correct definition. Yeah, I mean, so that's my basic takeaway. So I think we can get into, in terms of my stance, I'm generally a pluralist. I don't think there's one true meaning of any, like, there's a few words that have one meaning that are used.
Pluralist.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm gonna cut you here. Yeah.
Yeah. So, by pluralist, I mean that there are multiple views that can both be true in different contexts. So, some people would say, well, this word always has this meaning. Other people would say, no, it always has the other meaning. And so I'm a pluralist in the sense that I just don't think the word is used univocally. I think there are certain contexts where a word may be best used to mean something, and a different context where a word may best be used to mean something else. Just like the word bank. If someone says, I'm at the bank right now, and says, no, you're not. You're clearly not at a bank. I'm like, what are you talking about? Yes, I'm at a bank. No, you're not. Like, yes, I am. I'm just depositing my money. Like, no. Like, where's the water? Like, it's not flowing. There's no flowing water. It's like, okay, well, clearly we're talking about two different things by bank. You mean the bank of a river, and I mean the bank of where someone deposits their money. So that is and it's funny. It's ridiculous, but that is really the sort of thing that's going on with the language of the gender situation, where it's like, okay, well, are trans women? Like, oh, well, clearly they are. Clearly they're not. Like, well, don't you know it's adult human female, or don't you know it's this other thing? Like, no, you're just talking about different things. And if you were to just term substitute, if you were to just replace your meaning, instead of just using the word woman, you just replaced it with, are adult human females, are trans women adult human females? Obviously not. I mean, it just takes away all the ambiguity, and there's no debate at that point.
I know that Tom believes trans women are women, that's just a factual statement. And Tom, you can correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't think that people necessarily are transphobic for disagreeing that trans women are women, but that they are just ignorant or just don't understand what they're saying.
Yeah, originally when I was asked about the topic, my position is that if people say trans women aren't women, that they're wrong, but maybe not necessarily transphobic. I mostly engage in the pragmatics of this. So when I'm talking about what is a woman, I'm talking about how we use the words pragmatically and how we define them, why we define them that way, how we come to definitions. I'm also a pluralist, obviously, based on context. There's going to be different usages and definitions for these words. Obviously, sex is what people are talking about sometimes. You can't deny that, but it seems like gender is so built on top of our sex so much that we don't actually engage with the sex very often, and for the most part we're actually engaging with the gender by far the majority of the time, and especially in social contexts. I think the opposite, though. I think that when people are engaging in these conversations, they're not ever engaging in the descriptive. They are only being prescriptive. They say they're being descriptive. This is what a woman is, but they're only prescribing what they want that word to mean, or what they want people to mean when they say those words. They're never actually engaging in any sort of semantics or linguistics when they have these arguments. They are only saying, this is politically what I want it to mean, or because of some sort of outcome, I want it to mean this. And generally, I don't engage in that because I'm trying to focus just on what the word means, so that people have at least a starting point, so that they all have like an understanding and can move on from there. So if there is a prescriptive, like I said, I don't know that I've actually thought that much about that part of it. And yeah, I'm interested to hear what your prescription is in this case, because I would assume that would lead us to what is or is not transphobic. Or
a couple of things there. So I think both things could be true at the same time. People can be descriptive, and their descriptions can be motivated by their prescriptions. So, for example, outside of the gender context, there's this question of chiropractors or doctors, right? And I can say, well, chiropractors are not doctors, because by doctor, I just mean someone with an MD or DO, or another sense of doctor is in someone with a PhD or whatnot. And chiropractors don't have that, so therefore I'm descriptively, chiropractors are not doctors. Now, it could be also true that the reason I have that semantics and I'm being descriptive with my semantics in that way is because I'm motivated against giving the label doctor to chiropractors. In fact, that many people are like that. They don't want to give an air of legitimacy to chiropractors. Fair enough. But it's still the case that both things could be true. They can be descriptive, even if their descriptions are motivated by their prescriptions. Similarly with the transgender issues. Someone can say, well, I'm being descriptive when I say someone is a trans woman or not woman, what I mean is adult human female. They could be motivated in their description with certain prescriptions. They can say, well, I don't want to give this type of legitimacy of what women is to these individuals. And so descriptively, I'm going to say that adult human females are not, AKA women. They're not, trans women are not adult human females. And descriptively, that's true. And if they mean that, then their statement, trans women are not women, is true, descriptively. But at the same time, yeah, they're motivated, and it's fine. Both could be true. They're motivated by their prescriptions for having that semantics.
But that would just make it prescriptive. Like, obviously, prescriptions are going to be surrounded by a bunch of descriptive claims, and it might even lead you to a descriptive claim that is also prescriptive. But if it is prescriptive in any way, you're just being prescriptive. If that's not how things actually are, and you're not even engaging in how things are, like, if I keep saying that, like chiropractors are doctors, obviously lots of people disagree on that. And so it would come down to like what is true and just like lining up the descriptive claims for that to be true. But that's like I guess a more subjective claim than how we use language and how we come to meanings of words, where that is pretty definitive. Like, we have pretty conclusive ways of figuring out what a word means based on colloquial usage. And so if nobody's actually engaging in that process, in any sort of scientific process through linguistics, they are not engaging in the descriptive whatsoever.
Tom, let me ask this then. So let's say we have two different statements. So one statement is trans women are not women if by woman we mean adult human female. And then we have another statement that says we ought use semantics that woman is adult human female such that trans women are not women. Do you think those two statements are both just prescriptive statements? Or could it be that one statement is a descriptive statement, even if it may be motivated by the invoker by certain prescriptions they may hold?
I obviously I agree with the latter. Like, my point is that the argumentation that goes into the conclusion is always prescriptive. Like, it's always
You mean the motivation, right?
Yeah, sure, you could call it motivation, but like if you go into a debate and the entire time the person's saying like, well, what happens to women if we call trans women women? What happens to legislation? What happens, like what about the confusion? Like, that's all prescriptive. They're only trying to convince you that it's not a good thing to call trans women women, but they're not engaging in the pragmatics of it. And that's kind of my point, is that they're not actually engaging in any sort of descriptive realism.
And so so something similar like this came up for me where I try to point out, like, this is just the descriptive component of this is really just a semantic issue, and words can mean different things. And then one of the responses I got is the motivation. It's just, well, if we say that women means something other than adult human female, then what will happen to all the laws that use the term woman? Like, as if it would retroactively change or something. Like, what will happen to all the laws about women's sports? As if like the laws that were established before would somehow like retroactively, like that's how law works. Like, once we use a different term or a secondary or tertiary definition for a word, then it retroactively changes what is fixed by the law. And the response to that I had was just, there was this law that was written a while back about how you are supposed to keep your female dogs in their breeding season. You're supposed to not let them run about. And the word that used to describe the female dogs was bitch. You're not allowed. An owner must keep their bitch in a given environment. They're not allowed to let them roam. Yeah. So my question to this person is just like, do you think that given that we use the word bitch differently now, most commonly, we rarely call female dogs bitches anymore. In fact, we're probably more likely to call humans bitches than dogs. Whether it be a woman with certain qualities or an effeminate man or something. Do you think that law has retroactively changed now? Do you think that now legally, like if these people, now that they're not dogs anymore, get horny or something, they need to be locked up by this law? Is that what the law means now? Like, no, like
you're saying. And I feel like you guys both are aligned here. So let me just challenge you both for a moment, because I hate to bring up women's sports. But I think that's an example of, okay, what people before considered met the category of woman and what they are now considering the category of woman. They didn't need to reinterpret it. They just assumed trans women can compete in women's sports. So we actually didn't go back and make sure that we separated what maybe should have been. Not that it is a dig for anybody, but with competition comes rules for fairness and shit.
So my understanding is in the transgender inclusion of women's sports, that's a whole can of worms, but
yeah, it is.
But
just as an example of us not really going back for that language change.
No. But what I'm saying is that I think the undesirable components of that aren't because of the language change. I think it's because there is a motivated political movement to change certain rules about participation. And I think that if you look at the rules in various sports, you will see just that. You'll see that there needs to be there are certain regulations about how long you need to be on hormonal therapy before you're allowed to participate. Whether that's right or wrong, whether that does it enough justice or not, whether that's enough of meritocracy is a whole different conversation. But the point I'm bringing up here is that what ended up changing things in terms of transgender people participating in women's sports wasn't just the fact that there was a secondary or tertiary definition of the word woman that was added to the dictionary. That's not what did it. What did it was because there is a wider political movement that wants that to happen.
But you don't think that that's a motivating factor? Like, when we say women's sports, obviously we're talking about female sports. Yeah. But because we say women's sports, it is making it to where they say, well, they're women, so why can't they compete in those? Obviously, that's their category. If they are women, then they're supposed to compete in women's sports. If they're women, they're supposed to go in women's bathrooms. And so I do think that that's probably a motivating factor because we're using the language that way, and that's what we've labeled these things. They say woman on them, so what we call woman should be able to participate in those things.
Yeah, so I can imagine someone making an argument like that. I don't hear that argument being made by anyone I consider serious on the people on the transgender side advocating for participation in women's sports. The arguments that I typically hear are not anything like that. They're more along the lines of like, oh, well, if you look at now, whether these arguments are correct or not, whether they pan out on the data is a different question. But what I don't hear them saying is that, oh, well, we call them women and women means this, so therefore they should participate in women's sports because the word is the same. That would just be an equivocation. What I hear them saying is things like, oh, well, if they're on hormonal therapy for this amount of time, then their strength is brought somewhere in line within some reasonable expectation compared to cisgender women. Whether that's true or not is a different question. But what I don't hear them saying is that, oh, well, here's the word. The word in this case means adult human. Means not something other than adult human female, and so it should mean a not adult human female here. Like, no, that's just an equivocation.
That probably is the case in terms of bathrooms, though, right? Like in bathrooms, that probably is more so the case. Like it's a woman going in a woman's bathroom. They are labeled woman, so therefore they should go in the woman's bathroom.
But, I can imagine it being more common to make some sort of argument like that. But even then, like when I hear serious conversations about women's bathrooms, I still don't hear this argument. I don't hear it's like, oh, well, this has the label WOMAN, and so they should be in the WOMAN bath. Like, no, that's not. I mean, maybe some people, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but the serious conversations about women's bathrooms I've heard, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm sure it has.
Yeah, I think it's the places where it does happen. Mm-hmm. The people who do want to advocate and really I guess sort of push for inclusive language, they like to pretend that it doesn't happen or that we don't have to pay attention to the parts where it's happening, or because they have better arguments, better reasons for why they support it. They pretend like there aren't people who are supporting it for bad reasons. And it's almost like we are okay with any support that we get if it's going towards progressive movements and stuff like that. When really, I think it should be important that people are agreeing us and understand why they're agreeing with us, and not just being the people who say, woman is woman, so let them in.
Yeah, I can imagine. I certainly grant that there are certain individuals that will be happy with any sort of argument, no matter how silly, so long as it results in a given, support for their position that they want. Still, the main arguments that I hear that are taken seriously, at least, about women's bathrooms aren't the fact that, it's the label WOMAN. It's really about certain characteristics of the people that we're calling the WOMAN. Like, so for example, like, let's say you have some a female to FTM transgender man, and this person is incredibly muscular. They have hair all over their body. They have hair all over their face, but they have a vagina. The argument that I hear is that, well, it's probably the case that women will have a much more uncomfortable time with someone like that in their bathroom than a fully transitioned, someone who looks like Blair White. So that's the sort of types of arguments that I hear. Whether that's true or not is a different question, but the real arguments I hear aren't just like, oh, well, they should go in the woman's bathroom because they are a woman word, and on the bathroom it says woman, and it's the woman's bathroom. Like that. I mean, I think we could all. I think
it's not the label alone, but we are discussing whether or not they're equivalent to a woman in both cases. With sports and with the with bathrooms, we are arguing like whether or not they are equivalent and whether or not they qualify as what we consider to be a woman. That's what would make other women comfortable in the bathroom. That's what would make it fair in sports. We're talking about whether or not they actually qualify for this label, and that's part of saying that they are able to qualify for women's sports or a women's bathroom. Is we're saying, do they fit what it is that we consider to be womanhood, or do they fit what we consider to be femininity? Do they fit what we think is fair in this instance? Like, a lot of it is them qualifying for womanhood.
Now, because I do believe, Tom, what you just said, Dr. Avi, you would agree with him?
Yeah, I just want to make one quick one. So,
okay.
Yeah. So there's a difference in the question of like, okay, well, because we can all agree that it could be trivially the case that an individual can qualify as a woman depending on whatever we define woman to be, when we say woman's bathroom. The question is, what are the sorts of things that we ought, the prescriptive question is, what are the sorts of things that we ought put in this definition of woman in this context, such that we can decide who does and does not qualify under this umbrella term.
That's what I wanted to challenge both of you on.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that there might be things that need to be checked off to be automatically considered in the category of the gender that you're trying to belong in, or that you understand that you belong in. The question is, if that exists, then can self-ID exist?
I don't believe in self-ID.
Yeah, I think we're not going to have much disagreement there. We're neither of us are a fan of self-ID. I don't think anyone is a fan of self-ID.
Then I would ask you, because you acknowledge, like, okay, there are people who do make these bad arguments. The thing that I find that they have in common is that they do push for self-ID, and that maybe that might be a root cause to a lot of the issues with inclusive language. Like, this might be a great thing, actually. Making these spaces available should be a great thing, actually. But if it's coupled alongside self-ID, then it might not be worth it.
It might be the other way. It might be that the self-ID is a product of a desire to be as inclusive as possible, and that these other prescriptions are also things that just stem from that desire to be as inclusive as possible. So it might be that there's this underlying motivation that's resulting in this self-ID adoption, and also resulting in these adoptions of, if you self-ID, well, then you go in everything. Then you go in women's sports, then you go in the women's bathroom, then you go in like any women's space. Okay, well, that's it. So is your question that is the adoption of self-ID the motivating force behind inclusivity?
I would say, so where I think I'm at right now is the idea that self-ID is probably the biggest harm when it comes to accepting gender identities, or just like the freedom of expression and shit like that. I do think that when people push for self-ID, I think that's something that normal people, I don't mean to say normal people, just people who aren't terminally online in these spaces and understand these issues, I think that they will have the hardest time wrapping their head around it. And I do believe, because they're coming at it as reasonable as they can with this information, they get labeled transphobic, you're homophobic, you are rejecting trans rights, you are part of trans genocide or something. And I really do think that the whole thwarting self-ID is kind of alienating, and maybe even removing support for the trans movement.
I mean, this is why I said earlier that both sides seem to be engaging in like a prescriptive claim, where they're more so saying how they want things to be. Obviously, nothing is a thing because it is the thing. Like, that's just not how anything works. You can't just say, I am a woman, therefore I am a woman, or I identify as a woman, therefore I am a woman. I think that if we're actually engaging in gender linguistics the way that academics are, we're talking about weighted characteristics based on femininity, some biological characteristics, some things that are biological that make it to where you're more likely to be feminine, but we're engaging in like an overall concept that has been built around the idea of what a female is. Just like we have a parent, and everybody thinks of the parent role as this biological role, but eventually somebody can adopt kids and we just call them a parent. We don't actually care whether or not they are the biological parent. As long as they're fulfilling the role, we call them a parent. And it seems similar with what we call a woman. As long as they're fulfilling the role, we call them a woman, and there will be absolutely no difference for the majority of people the majority of the time when we're not engaging with their genitalia or their like chromosomes or their gametes or any of those things in any way, it wouldn't actually make a difference to us whether or not they're a male or a female if we're talking about whether or not they're a man or a woman. But I think that people choose not to think about it that way in protest of what gender identity is doing or transgenderism is doing or all of these other things. I feel like most of the time both sides are just in protest to what the other side is doing, and so they're coming up with horrible arguments to protest the other side, really.
Yeah. No, I don't know if it's the most damaging thing. It's certainly a very damaging thing, self-ID, toward any sort of progress. In fact, I think it opens pathways up to a lot of harm towards transgender individuals. But just want to make a quick clarification of my position. So I agree that both sides are engaged in prescriptive, all sorts of prescriptive things around this. Completely agree with that. It's when I say that they're engaging in descriptive claims and talking past each other, it's not to say that they're not motivated prescriptively. On the contrary, it's because they're motivated prescriptively. If anything, that's the reason why their descriptive claims end up talking past each other, because they're so heavily entrenched in this culture war that they can't. It's almost like they're incapable of analyzing the other side's position on their own semantics.
If I can use Anna Kasperi as an example, did you both follow her recent dilemmas with the term birthing person?
I'm vaguely aware. I've seen some clips. I don't know like if she has like a full fleshed out position. I'm not aware of it. But I don't know. I understand she's not a fan of it.
Yes, not a fan of it. She views it almost, Tom, you can correct me if I'm getting this wrong, views it almost sexist as resorting women down to their genitals or parts. Mm-hmm. And I look at Anna Kasparian as somebody who does support trans people, trans rights, respects trans identity. And the moment that she voices her feelings on a matter, she's viewed as transphobic instantaneously. How do we tell when somebody is like being influenced or something by their own bias, or just allow for somebody to actually be part of a movement but disagree with it slightly?
The part with Anna that was weird is that she was saying, I don't like it when people call me a birthing person. And so everybody's like, wait, nobody ever calls an individual person a birthing person. They talk about groups of people as birthing persons, but nobody ever says this person is a birthing person. So then they said, when has anybody ever called you a birthing person? When did this ever happen? And she never really went into detail on that, but she did continuously rail against the being called a birthing person. It seems like it's based on the utility. Like if we call a guy who goes into...
No, Tom, because I'm pretty sure that we even saw in Congress, and which was like an embarrassing moment for Democrats, to see somebody correct another, I think it was representative or senator, when they were talking about pregnancies and women. They corrected to say person instead of woman.
Yeah.
But that's still talking about the group, though, right?
What?
Was that talking about a specific person's pregnancy, or was that talking about...
No, just in general, because I think the topic was abortion.
That is what I'm saying, is that the issue is that if we're talking about a group of people, we're just separating it from what we think of as a woman or a female, and we're just talking about the people who can give birth, and so they use birthing person as the overall group. Like if we talk about sperm donors for men, like, is this talking about some sort of biological function? Yeah, of course, but we're talking about a group of people who are donating sperm, right? Just as if we're talking about birthing person, we're talking about groups of people.
Different. I feel like it's different when that happens in Congress, when you're having a conversation about women's bodies through their pregnancy, but you don't even want to refer to them as women. That it's not inclusive enough, even though we know it is.
It's also not exclusive enough either. Like, we're not talking about women who have been through menopause. We're not talking about women who can't have children. We're not talking about women who are infertile. We're talking about birthing persons.
Colloquially, I believe, when we refer to women, we imagine that that's who can get pregnant. And we understand the other circumstances in which they can't get pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't need to put that after the fact when we say pregnant woman. But I do feel like we want to pretend like there's some sort of question when it comes to other genders. And like when we use or when we're referring to pregnancies, and I don't understand why that comes up, why we need a broader term when there's never been a question of who's being referred to.
I think I could probably explicate Anna's issue, and maybe she did a poor job saying it, because I don't think that the main issue that Anna has is that she was called, or any individual is called, a birthing person. I think even if no specific individual was called a birthing person, and it's only being used to refer to a group of people, I think she'd still have a problem with that, and I think it's for similar reasons. Similar reasons as if maybe some men might be upset, as if for sperm bank donations, they, instead of saying men, they would say, well, jizzing people who jizz. That it's like, okay, like the issue is just that there was no question of before about whether we needed to find people who jizz. Like, we knew that already. We know that we're talking about people who can get pregnant, people who can give birth. Saying birthing person doesn't add anything to the conversation. I mean, that was common knowledge already. We already do everything in the medical field to get to proxy or get to that anyway. And to just,
my understanding was that she was okay with the group. I could be wrong on that, but that was my understanding, was that she was okay, and understood that we use this for groups of people and that's okay. But she thought it was messed up if we call individual people birthing persons. So I could be wrong on this, but I could have sworn that's what she was saying.
I didn't know that. So if Anna would be okay, then
confirm that either. So that's just Tom.
So you're saying Anna would be okay if no individual was called birthing people, but woman as fertile woman who can, have all the parts for giving birth, for getting pregnant, giving birth. If language was just adopted, instead of to call them women, to call them birthing people, but only if they were talking about a class of people, like a group of people, she would be okay with that.
Yeah, we were talking about this. We had a couple of debates about this on my channel, and then we also had a panel about it. And each time that was brought up is that, like, she was okay if you're talking about a group of people, just not to an individual. And so people kept asking, okay, when did somebody call you a birthing person then? Like, when did this ever happen? I don't know, for me personally, because when we're talking about like trans men having babies or something like this, I think that they were just trying to be more specific in what they were talking about without making sure that they were being inclusive but also exclusive. And so the term came up just for legislation and for like scientific things. It's not like a colloquial term that people are supposed to be walking around calling each other birthing persons or anything like that. It's really just to refer to like a group, just to be more specific. Whether or not that's actually necessary, I have absolutely no idea. But
I think regardless of what Anna has, I don't look. So I don't know what Anna has said. I don't know what her view on that is, on that, whether on those particulars. But I think the best case against the usage is really just that, like, it really doesn't add much. It adds very little in terms of utility. We already knew everything that it's referring to by the old terms, and whatever, so it has very little upshot. And then there's like a whole bunch of people who are going to get offended by this. So it's like, well, what are we doing?
Would you say, Tom, could you agree, just to understand what Avi's saying, because now he's, kind of echoing my beliefs, so I feel myself in him right now. Would you say that birthing person and its resurgence or its push right now is kind of like BIPOC?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe.
It's almost used to virtue signal, like, hey, I'm super progressive, I'm very inclusive. and I use it as a litmus test to see how inclusive you are. And it's like almost designed to, I don't know, antagonize.
It's possible. I think, like, from what I understood, it was just language that was only used for, like, legislation and for, like, the science community to use, just for them to be more specific. If they don't think that that's necessary or that that's helpful in any way, then I don't have an opinion on it, so I don't really care. But
Okay.
but if they're actually using
Tell you what
it
a lot
in,
of female doctors' opinion on that is. That's about being told that, hey, listen, when you were talking about women before, like, no, you need to say birthing people.
Mhm.
I've heard this POV. What is, because you are a doctor, so you probably do interact more female doctors as well. What is the limit
Generally,
there?
they do not want from. Actually, I've yet to meet one that I'm sure there are people who are supported. I'm sure they exist. I have yet to meet a female doctor who has been told something like that and been like, "Whoa, that's like no, I'm not doing that." And look, I imagine there's a lot of components that go into that. Some of which I've already said. Like, are you insulting my intelligence? Do you think I didn't know what I was talking about before? Also, like, now you're gonna, in combined with, like, already they're being objectified, and already they're going through medicine and struggling with people, like, taking them for their looks and taking them for their body parts and everything like that. Now it's just one more thing that adds nothing, but just adds this one more little thing that gets people like, okay, now I'm just referring to people of my sex just by these body parts. So those might be my speculative in terms of the motivations of why. Generally, in my experience, I've found women doctors that I've interacted with not to be in favor of that term. Yeah, they don't like it from what I've seen. And I get it. Like, it's, again, like,
it seems like the term takes away information.
I don't know if it takes away.
The times I've recently been to the doctor's office, they do want to see your ID, which has your sex on it, and then you're also to fill out forms letting them know how you identify. Like this, there's a lot of information there.
Yeah.
But when you just want to be referred to as person, I feel like you do take away information.
Well, I don't know if it would result in taking away information, because all those same forms would still be filled out in a doctor's office, even if we adopted that language. I think the biggest issue with it is
communication between doctors. No.
No, we still would communicate. I mean, we would say, see, even if we said birthing person, all of the other information, it's not like, we would somehow, like, communicate all the other information that we would normally communicate. We would just not communicate. I don't think that's something that would happen. Okay. I think the issue is just really that it really just doesn't add a whole lot for us. It's like, we know the sorts of people who in principle can get pregnant and not get pregnant. We know the sorts of individuals who can ovulate, who can have implantation. We know what a uterus is. We know what eggs are. It's not like this is adding anything to what is already implied by the terminology that's already being used. It seems like what's happening is this is just a front. It's not like there was this genuine concern of like, oh, well, you guys are just, you doctors are just, you're confused. Like you should understand that really it's, the language you need to use is birthing people so that you don't get confused about who can get pregnant. Like, no, fuck that. Like, we know who can get pregnant. Like, it's not like we don't collect that information. So that's not, I don't think that was even the motivation. I think that the motivation is, I think that's the excuse. The motivation is really just to be more inclusive.
Well, I mean, we came to talk about inclusive language, and one of my argument initially was that it's more so about whether or not they're right or wrong, and that would make a bigger difference. But that seems to be like your argument here, is that like it's not as much the you can still be right or wrong with the other language. You can still be correct without using what we would consider inclusive language. So do you not feel a need to use inclusive language then?
It depends on it depends. So it really is context dependent. When I think of term usage broadly, the things I look at are the following. If it's used in a given proposition, the first thing I ask myself is on the term usages in the proposition, is it a true or false claim? So that's the first thing I look at. The first thing I look at is it coherent? Is it something that, doesn't contain any internal contradictions? Is it something that I, at least in principle, can understand the meaning of it? And then once I understand the meaning of it, the next question I ask myself is it true or false? And then if there's two ways of saying something that's true, then it's a question of values. Then it's saying like, okay, well, is there a way we can say the same thing with either more clarity, less effort, or hurting less people? Like, those are the types of considerations that I have in mind. And in the instance of, the birthing person term as it pertains to medicine, the reason I just don't see a lot of motivation there is because doctors already have a lot of it might seem to non-doctors that there's not a lot of clarity because it's just the term woman being used, which can mean a lot of different things. But in the context of like reproductive medicine, when someone talks about a fertile woman, when two doctors talk, it's not like a question about the sort of things that they're talking about. Like, you don't need this term, birthing person to replace the term woman, even though it might seem like that to certain laymen, because there already is a lot of clarity there. So it's a true statement, it's coherent, it's a true statement. There's already a lot of clarity. And then the question is it does adopting this new thing, does it have any other utility benefits? So does it give the same clarity with less effort? Well, no, not really. It's like it requires a whole change in our usage. So that's not true.
Okay, if we are bringing up utility, because I actually think that you might disagree with yourself here. So with doctors' offices, especially considering malpractice, I think there are a lot of offices that will take the patient's comfort into account for a good visit. If we knew that there was utility in making patients feel welcome, feel like they could trust this office, return to this office for their visits to keep up their wellness visits, which is important for if they're covered by insurance. Insurance companies look for that, especially in a doctor's office. Would you find utility in making a doctor's office really focus on inclusive language for those people that are going to be coming in and out?
Well, so I'll answer the question that I think. So whether we make a doctor's office, whether we that implies that's a bit of a different question.
Well, I'm saying that as if you own one, just because I used to work at an office, so we would make rules. So like
generally, yes, but generally, if someone says, look, if I had a patient and the patient says, listen, for whatever reason, this might sound weird, but I do want to be referred to as a birthing person and not a woman. Let's just say they said that. Yeah, I'd say, okay, you are the best birthing person ever. Like, okay, like I don't have a problem doing that. It's okay. Like, you want to be called by just like a name. Like, okay, you want to be called by this. Okay, I'll call you by this. But that's a different question than saying, in general, should we just switch over our language broadly? Do we have a reason to do that and adopt a broad birthing person usage in terms of instead of you saying woman? So that's a different question. So in terms of the broad usage,
it absolutely is different questions, and I think for most people who maybe see themselves in this topic, I don't think they think about changing everyone's language. I think they look to be respected as an individual person if this is the language that makes them feel better. Sometimes I believe that that's the conversation that people want to have.
And I think the argument is actually more so that you would say birthing person to include trans men, and that it would be trans men. So instead of saying like, oh, well, instead of saying trans or a birthing person, we would say pregnant man. Like, you would just start saying birthing person that would include both pregnant women and pregnant men, I think is what their thought process was behind it.
That is I agree. That's at least part of the what's being said. But again, I've never been met by specialists in reproductive endocrinology and fertility or whatnot who are confused on this issue because they are not using the term birthing person. I haven't met a single one of them who is confused about whether in principle a transgender man can get pregnant. In fact, I've seen the opposite. They're all very cognizant and aware of this.
I agree with you. I'm only inserting my opinion here because I did work at a doctor's office for a long time in New York City, and I do remember us having a whole layout of change when it came to getting a diabetes specialist, because they would see a lot of obese patients, and working with a lot of Hispanic women, they are not kind. Some of them say fat as a nickname. So there was like a lot of, I don't know, like not kindness training, but things that we wanted staff to be aware of because it was not good for the patient or would result in patients not coming back to the office. And I do wonder sometimes the push for inclusive language, if it's more so for an individual basis than it is to just like rewrite our dictionary.
Yeah, and so I agree that if there is an issue in a doctor's office where the doctor's office, for whatever reason, is met with certain individuals who just, again, they do want to be called as birthing people, whether that's because they're transgender men or whatnot, then yeah, on an individual level, just call them that. That's fine. But again, just like in the case you've provided, where certain terms to certain populations or certain specific individuals within the population might be more offensive, and again, that's fine. Just recognize the solution is to just recognize that, and on an individual level, adopt language accordingly. And that's a very easy fix.
What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
What do you think if you're
I
done
just want to
sucking your fucking vape?
That's still a different question. That's still the different question than what's being proposed. The question of just changing things on an individual level and adopting accordingly is still different than this broad
I
change.
agree. I agree that it is different. And as somebody who has watched so many discussions about trans identity and inclusion, it always comes down to, why can't you just respect this person? This is just what is going to make this person feel like they are a part of. That everywhere else in life, they feel like they are other. And if just using this one word, if using this pronoun, if just being able to have a broad term for a category that even though maybe they're just like, there should be like an asterisk of whether or not they belong there, why can't we do that to maybe bring happiness up? So I go back and forth all the time because I'm like, listen, you cannot challenge my worldview with language, but also I do care about you as a person and I don't want you to feel ostracized. It's very difficult balance for me.
Yeah, that's why I brought up like the fact that you seem to be in favor of like inclusive language as a necessity, and that if that's the case, you would think that within legislation, instead of just saying pregnant women or something like that, that I would assume you would want them to say birthing person, so that they are being more inclusive in the way that they're writing these laws and crap like that.
So whether the so I'm not in favor or against increasing the inclusivity or increasing the exclusivity of term usages per se. Whether I'm going to be in favor of that and the broad question is just going to depend on how much that conforms to my values. So one of the values is, yes, making people happier or achieving certain goals, like conveying meaning. All of these things fill into something we can call utility. And so the question in terms of the broad question of calling people birthing people because some individuals might be happier. Yeah, I agree. There are certain individuals that may be happier if we adopted that broadly. I also think there are going to be a lot of individuals who are going to be a lot less happy if we adopted that broadly. They're going to be, in fact, quite enraged. So the question of whether on the net that's going to increase or decrease utility, it's certainly not clear to me that it's going to increase utility if we adopted that broadly. And I think there may be some good reasons to believe it may decrease utility because, look, while I may not know all the numbers of how many people may increase or decrease in terms of happiness, although I do suspect most people don't want it that way, there's also other considerations. Like there's an inherent consideration of the disutility of shifting language. Like, this is one of the issues with a question of, well, why can't we use any word to mean anything? Well, we can, and it might be true, but there's a disutility that comes with that, which is you're using just proprietary terms, and you're going to have a disutility of communication. It's going to be harder for you to communicate with people. There's an inherent work that it takes to change the language that people are using, you're using, and other people are using. And so that the benefits need to be worth that initial investment. In the case of women meaning something other than adult human female, that work's already been done a lot for the most part. I mean, there's like 38% of Americans at this point on Pew, according to Pew Research, already think that woman refers to something other than adult human female. So that's
Do you
why
credit any of that to Matt Walsh? I feel like his What is a Woman documentary kind of made people question if they even know what a woman is, even though he's aiming to be transphobic in it. Do you know what I mean?
Well,
like it started a broader discussion.
Well, I'm not sure how much of it is about Walsh. I mean, that was there's a lot I can say about that, but just to complete the previous point. Yeah, so in terms of the broad question, it's not clear to me that it would make people on the net happier if the change was adopted. It certainly would take a lot of effort. It would take a lot of coaxing. It would take a lot of it would take a lot of people to change their term usage. It doesn't seem like it would add anything in terms of doctors' understanding, and whether that would, I have a suspicion that actually it may make more people upset than it makes people happy, just because of the difference in populations. So if anything, I actually have a suspicion that it would decrease utility to broadly adopt that term. Unlike woman as meaning in certain contexts something other than adult human female, I don't think it would have that effect.
I mean, one of the things that you brought up is whether or not the rest of the population would want that label to refer to them. Whereas currently it seems like there's a lot of women who say, I don't want the label women to refer to trans women, because now that label is still being referred back to me as though I'm part of this group, and I wouldn't feel comfortable with the label woman anymore. Does that... Real
quick, when we turn, are you talking about the label woman or the label birthing person?
Woman. I'm talking about the label woman, because when you're talking about with birthing person, you said that that the person, if some people don't want to be called birthing person, that would be like a huge part of your thought process on whether or not we should use the terminology. But if currently there's a ton of females who say, I don't want the word woman to refer to me if it also refers to males who are trans, would you take that into consideration in the same way?
Of course I would. It is part of the thought process, and the reason that it doesn't on the net result in as much weight as the birthing person is because on the latest data it's a lot more split down the middle than what I think birthing person is. So if we were to poll people with birthing person and say, ask a few questions like, okay, are you comfortable with this label referring as a category to include you? And also, how uncomfortable are you? Like, how upset are you about this? My suspicion is women are going to be, by and large, uncomfortable with it. And I think that the degree of uncomfortability is going to be high. They're going to be like, this is something that's really messed up. I suspect if you were to ask the same question for, okay, well, if we take a more gender inclusive term of just the word woman, not talking about birthing people, but in some definition of woman that includes at least many transgender women, would you be uncomfortable with it, and how uncomfortable would you be? I suspect that yes, some women would be uncomfortable with that, but I suspect both the proportion of women that would be uncomfortable with it, as well as the degree of uncomfortability on the net, would be substantially less than they would if we were talking about terms like birthing people referring to them. So that would be...
Tom, I like something that you brought up earlier, because it's one of the things that I use to really think about another situation that just as a woman, and maybe men too feel this way, but I'm just playing my woman card. Really, I don't know, just it was super off to me, and that was seeing a trans woman breastfeeding. It really, really alarms me. Everything that I've looked up, everything about inducing medication to make it so that a trans woman can lactate, it's all still, the data isn't like there. We don't know if it is safe or not. And then there are a lot of concerns for an infant to use the energy, use their resources to breastfeed potentially from a source that isn't giving them nutrition, could be like starving a child. I saw that and I just thought, danger, bad parent. You should not do that. And I didn't like the idea. Oh, I heard an echo. Hello? Okay, we're good now. I didn't like the idea of affirming your gender by putting your child at risk. And there were people who challenged me and made me think about wet nurses. And from there, I still didn't get like this challenging feeling, because you look at a wet nurse and it's still a woman. So they're what are they called? Ducks. They're still producing milk that is nutritional for a baby. But when I thought about surrogate mothers and what we did there, and the ability for another woman to carry someone else's baby entirely, like science can take us to a place that seems off, that seems almost like against nature. And while I'm not on board with trans women breastfeeding right now, because we're not sure if it works. I think if we found out that giving medicine to a trans woman, or doing something to make it so that she can breastfeed and give her baby nutrition, like I think I would be okay with it. Do you guys have any feelings about that?
So I haven't done a deep dive on the nutritional profile of the breast milk of transgender women. So all I can really talk about is like the principal question that you've just answered, which is that
with using surrogacy and stuff. Yeah.
No. In theory, like okay, so let's say it's the case that it turns out like, oh, the nutritional profile is inadequate in some way. If there were medications that these individuals could take that would make the nutritional profile of the breast milk adequate for rearing children, would you be okay with trans women breastfeeding?
I absolutely would. I don't, and I think that's because I don't have any religious beliefs that make me reject science and like medical advancements. And for the most part, the only people that I do see that say instantaneously, no, that should never happen, they usually have some sort of like religious backing, and they feel like nobody should intervene in God's plan. But
Right. It's not about the nutrition. It's not about the about whether it's nutritionally adequate for those people. That's just kind of like the front.
Yeah, to them, it's generally like an abomination thing. And I don't believe we feel that way for anything else when it comes to adoption, when it comes to surrogacy. So I do try to reject that when it comes to other issues.
Yeah. I think there was a paper I saw, I could be wrong, about the nutritional content of transgender woman breast milk, but I'd have to confirm that. I'm not sure if it was about that or something.
It as recently as 3 months ago, and there's no consensus.
Yeah, no, I don't know if there's a consensus or not. It was like some investigation, some paper investigating it. Yeah. I'm not sure. It just passed by on like my feed, and I didn't like dig into it or anything. But I'd be interested if anyone finds any papers. That's actually something interesting.
Yeah, I think it is. I think that would be. I would be shocked if it's successful.
Mm-hmm. So when you say successful, you mean like nutritionally adequate, or do you mean
yes,
like
if it's nutritionally adequate? I would be shocked.
Yeah.
Tom, any opinions?
I have not really looked into that
yeah, sorry,
whatsoever.
I just
when you talked about it, it made me think of the TikTok video I saw recently of the trans woman who wants to get implantation of a fetus so they can be the first trans woman to have an abortion. So that's You didn't see this?
No,
So-
I didn't see this. What the fuck?
Yeah, they want to be the first
Okay.
trans woman to have an abortion, and
I think that is like sometimes it just feels like they're looking to offend people. And
everybody does
I don't
that
understand
to
why.
some extent, but yeah, that only seems to hurt them. So
Yeah.
I think I found it as a case report where they described the nutritional profile. They described it as robust, although I have to read the full study. And
Okay.
I'm not sure which medications to induce lactation that they did. So, yeah.
Interesting.
I don't see a reason why, at least, I mean, whether we're there or not is a different question, but I don't see a reason why, at least in principle, it can't be done. Because you can induce glandular and ductal differentiation in the breasts, in biological males. So you certainly can do that. And they seem to operate in a very similar way, if not the same way, that the glandular and breast tissue, when exposed to the same hormonal milieu and whatnot, operates in females.
Always taught that
Mhm.
men's nipples serve no purpose. And I understand that these individuals are no longer men. I understand transitioning,
Mhm.
but they were born with useless nipples, is like my mental understanding. So again, I will just be surprised if we can make them useful.
Well, let me ask. I don't know if I should ask this question. Well, there are certain uses of male nipples that may be in a different sort. I don't think they're necessarily completely useless. At least they certainly could be.
No, I
But-
know that they function in some way, and like some guys want you to like hurt them through their nipple or whatever. Like they have feeling sensation. They're functional,
Mhm.
but
Yeah,
not
in
as
a-
valuable as women's nipples.
Yeah. There is. I just want to address one concern potential that I'm trying to think of what a commenter would say. If the issue is testosterone levels, I think they undergo androgen blockade to induce it in some cases, and even then, absorption of just testosterone orally is not very biologically bioavailable. Most of it just gets broken down in the liver, even in baby livers. So that's one potential concern that I could address. And then the other thing, in terms of like the functionality of nipples, I don't see like in principle why. I'm not aware of a principled reason why male nipples could not be, at least theoretically, modified to serve similar functions as female nipples. Because you can induce all types of like differentiation, you can induce all types of modifications through different hormones in very similar ways. So maybe there is, that I'm just not aware of it. But at least in principle, I don't think there's a reason why we would believe that it can't be done with like, advances in technology or whatever.
That's good news for you in the future, Tom.
yeah, thank you.
There you go.
I did want to talk about get to the inclusive language on trans people. But you had, so initially we were talking about like some sort of prescriptive claim for the language and how it is that we believe people ought to use the language, like assuming pronouns and words like man and woman. It sounds like we already agree on the pragmatic nature of how we use man and woman, and that it changes in different contexts. So if we have, what is the prescription there? What is it that you think we ought to do in these scenarios?
Yeah, so my general evaluation for terms like this is similar to my evaluation for just about any term. There are certain bits of utility that I weigh And some of them can weigh more than others, and they can conflict. They can they can push one in not one direction or another. So one thing I look for is, assuming that we're talking about coherent, true statements with given term usages. One thing I look for is how the ease of communication. So I generally prefer semantic usages that are easier, that result in easier communication compared to communication that takes more time. That less people understand. It requires more explication. So if there's a simple, quick, to the point way of communicating the same concept, I generally like that. That's a utility point in favor. Another thing that I look for is, as I mentioned before, the ease of adoption, or the force of adoption. So how easy or hard it is to get people on board with what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to radically alter, an already existing, term to mean something else, one concern would be like, okay, well, there's a disutility in doing that. Another concern I have that will be weighed in is people's views on what they want it to be, people's comfortability with certain terms. And that's part of, that's what makes the utility calculus so hard in a lot of cases, is because, at least is talking on a national level or a global level, because there's a lot of, well, more so national level, because there's a lot of people very polarized on both sides of this. So if I find myself in, I can certainly imagine if I find myself in just a scenario where there's a whole bunch of people who are on one side of the aisle, I might just use the word in one way just for ease of communication. I might say, okay, well, I know all of you are never going to understand what I mean by the term woman if I don't use it in the adult human female way, because you all are so attached to this religiously. Or the other side attached religiously, whatever. So I might just, in certain circles, use the word woman and the way they use it, just that's the way they understand it, just for ease of communication. But in terms of my prescriptions in terms of where I'd like to see things move over as a whole, I don't know if I even want that. I'm not sure if I even. So I'm not sure.
When I say prescriptive, what I mean is that originally we were invited to go on a panel where the two of us were supposed to argue that that saying trans women aren't women is transphobic. And so I'm saying that you're being prescriptive if you say that is transphobic, right? So when we talk about labels that are stigmatized, something like racist, transphobe, sexist, these are meant to be warning signs that we put on somebody that says they're using dangerous language, or this is a dangerous person, and we're trying to stigmatize what it is that they're doing, and or the person themselves, either the actions or the person. And in this case, I don't know that there's actually utility in that. I think that a lot of the trans movement has kind of hurt the way that we use these labels a lot of times. And so I think that even using words like transphobic can be...
you're asking the label transphobic. I was so confused. I'm not
sorry.
Sure what we're calling. So I thought we were just talking about prescriptions on the word woman still. Okay.
Sorry.
That's a whole okay. So your question then is, what are my views on the label transphobic, or? Yeah,
because I was saying that the question was, if they don't call them a woman, then they are being transphobic, right? And so I'm saying that you are prescribing a label of transphobic to that scenario where they choose not to call a trans woman a woman.
So on my usage of the word transphobic, I don't think someone just having a different semantic for the word woman that doesn't include trans women would be transphobic, at least not necessarily. What I take transphobia to be is some sort of irrational fear or hatred or dislike toward transgender people. Or something motivated by that. That's what I take it to be. And so there's no real analytic relation between someone using a different semantic and just not having those features present. Now, some people have a more broad notion of what transphobia means, and they say, well, even if you are not having this irrational dislike or fear or hatred towards these individuals, the fact that your statement may result in harm to these individuals makes it transphobic, or makes it racist. It's the same similar thing with more broad adoptions of the term racism. Now, I don't use that term for racism. I don't use that term for transphobia. I don't use that term for homophobia. I don't use that broad adoption. And the reason I don't is because I don't think that tracks what we mean by the term. I don't think that, just if someone has the best intentions in mind and unfortunately results in harm to a group that they never intended to, I don't think we want to call that individual, whatever, phobic. That just doesn't track with what I think common usage is. And so, no, I think really what gets to the heart of those terms is that something is invoked with a motivation in mind, and that motivation is bad in some way. It's bad because it's a irrational type of dislike, disdain, vitriol toward a given group of people. And that's the sort of thing that I mean by those X-phobic terms.
But it sounded like at the beginning you were saying that you wouldn't call it transphobic just because they have a semantic difference in how they're using the language.
No,
so,
I wouldn't.
Okay. All right. So maybe I'm confused. Okay. So from my vantage point, I guess I can go ahead and just explain why I think I might be confused. From my vantage point, I got a message saying, hey, you and Avi debate together saying that this is transphobic. And I said, I don't think it's transphobic, but I at least think it's wrong. And I got a message back saying, well, Avi would rather talk to you about inclusive language then. And so my thought was, okay, so he thinks that it is transphobic, and he would like to convince me that it's transphobic because otherwise we would just do the debate together on this being transphobic. Is that incorrect, or?
Just to be clear about what I said to Avi, I did present him with a 4-person panel where there would be people who disagree, none of who were, I was not looking for transphobic people. And I know Avi specifically was more interested in one-on-one conversations, doesn't want like the big panel, but he thought that you guys would have
okay, fair enough.
Something to talk about.
Oh yeah,
not so much that he knew you disagree.
Yeah, I wasn't. I was so basically.
That
I think
sense.
those are kind of a clusterfuck. I don't know if you agree or disagree with me on that. The type of things that I don't like about panels are, it's very hard. Like in the conversation, for example, contrary to like a conversation we're having right now, it's very hard to stick to one issue and just dial it down and response. Okay, well, what about that response? Get to the bottom of that response. Okay, well, there's a counter. Okay, get to the bottom of that counter. I think that's a lot easier to do. Sometimes it can be even hard to do in just one-on-one conversations. And so, yeah, I went into this conversation really just because that was the alternative that was offered to me compared to a panel. And I'm like, all right, you know what? She wanted me to do a panel. Okay, I'm not doing a panel because I hate panels.
That makes sense.
She wants me to do, if she's offering, okay, well, what about one-on-one conversation? I'm happy to fill the time doing that. I came into this not knowing even what your views were. So I just wanted to see if we had any disagreement. It seems like we agree on a lot of this.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't necessarily think we have much, maybe a few like points of minutia we might disagree on, but I think broadly, I think with explication, we're in agreement.
Yeah.
I think Tom is more for inclusive language, and I think you are more reluctant to change language without a need or purpose. If I could summarize where we've gotten so far.
In terms of adjusting language to be inclusive or exclusive, my view is really just it depends. It depends what we get out of it and what we lose from it. That's all. That's the analysis to be done.
I don't think that
Tom,
I'm more
what was
so.
your opinion on my summary?
I don't think that I'm more so in favor of inclusive language. Most of the arguments that I've been making are just things that I thought might be contradictions in what he was saying in one part versus another. As I started off earlier, I don't normally engage in what we ought to do with language, and I try to avoid it as much as possible. So I'm I haven't really thought through those sorts of things very much. Most of the time when people come to me with that, I kind of steer them into a more pragmatic view of language so that we can actually talk about what is instead of what ought to be, because I just don't, I feel like most people never even consider what is before they start talking about what ought to be. And I don't think you can talk about what ought to be if you don't know what is. And so it's very frustrating to try to have those conversations with people who haven't even thought through the basics first. So I normally just focus on the basics and just focus on the pragmatics of language instead of prescribing how we ought to use language. And so I'm pretty open to like being convinced of different things, but so far everything that he said, especially as far as utility and what's pragmatic in these scenarios, I think I agree with all of that.
Good conversation, because listening to everything you just summarized there, I feel up in the air. Like I don't like when the conversation about anything is just summarized in is, ought, prescriptive, descriptive, utility. Like I like that you guys sort of talked about it on more normie levels, at least, even though it did have some of that shit in it.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, like he said earlier, lots of people immediately turn to the harm that'll be caused from the language that you're using. And I think that it's hard, especially with trans people, because they are challenging a lot of the ways that we think about things, but they're also a very, very small group of people, and they are having a massive effect on social norms. And so it's really strange to consider just how small this group is and how how much change they're affecting right now. And so, yeah, I do think that there's maybe some lines that we're crossing at some points where things are going a little bit too far, and it's always because of the harm that will be caused, but it's the harm that will be caused to an insanely small group that maybe isn't as relevant to have that dramatic of a change overall. So it's as much as like you want to be inclusive as long as there's no harm to anybody else, it seems like lots of people disagree on whether or not there actually is harm to anybody else and whether or not they're okay with these changes in language and changes in social norms. And I don't think that that's taken into consideration as much.
Well, so I don't know if the harm is just to transgender individuals, because you have to. There's a tendency when people adopt a given cause who are not transgender, but they may be like, so for example, they might look at like, progressives at large or liberals at large or whatnot, and they may, hear certain language and say, oh, well, that's harming me because I'm triggered by it or something. Mm-hmm. Just like, much like, certain men can be triggered by terms that they view as sexist, even though they're not women, right? So to play devil's advocate here, where they would say, I mean, it's really not devil's advocate, it is a consideration. It's just, they would say, well, it's not just the population. Yes, they are a small population, but at the same time, whether they're a small population or not, there is a large population that's taken up their cause. And because there's a large population that has now taken up their cause, that is part of the calculus now.
Is it though? Because aren't they offended or triggered on behalf of those other people? Like, it doesn't actually affect them in any real way. It only affects them as far as they believe it affects another group of people. Like, we could have made up trans people and just told them trans people exist, and they could be just as triggered without that real harm.
Yeah. So if they're being, even if they're suffering with their, we can call it so, like, let's just. So even if their suffering is only in virtue of them believing other people are suffering, that doesn't somehow make them not suffer. So, if I hear, like, let's just imagine, like, we hear, like, is there any news that, would make you really sad? Like, let's say you hear that your dog died or something, and it turns out that your dog was still alive. I don't know how much of a good analogy that is, but even if the only reason you're sad is because you're not the one being harmed, your dog is being harmed. Actually, whether let's drop the part about the dog being alive still or not harmed, because they would say like, no, trans people are really harmed. So that's not a one-to-one analogy.
Yeah. Plus, if my dog died, I would have eaten it, and I would know that it was dead.
Yeah.
I'm just.
But the point.
You're vegan, so it's just
No,
joking.
it's fine. It's fine. Wait. There is a point.
Okay, go ahead.
The point here is just that even if the reason you're sad is because you're sad about your dog suffering, you're still suffering because it doesn't somehow make it so that you're not suffering now, right? When I hear, I've had a dog that died, and I've had multiple dogs that died. Actually, it's they get of old age, and it's sad, and the fact that it was sad because the dog of considerations because of the dog, in no way somehow makes my sadness any less sad. Because of it, it just means that it's that's all. So they would say something like that.
Okay. Yeah, I think though that there was like an actual dog that actually existed at some point or something like that. Like that, it makes sense that one way or the other you have the loss of that dog. Whereas in this scenario, we're talking about a group of people that wouldn't actually be affected, and so they're always offended or affected on behalf of that group. That lots of times even seems as though that group may not even have a consensus, or if there is a consensus, that consensus might disagree with what the uber progressive narrative is on what they believe that the consensus is. And so it's just it seems like a lot of I think that it should be more about what we actually think. If we're talking about utility and talking about the harm, it would make a lot more sense if we're actually thinking about the actual group and what is actually fair in those scenarios.
Well, if we're talking about utility, what would make sense is to talk about utility. Even like you can say like this utility is coming. I take objection. I don't like that this utility is coming from something X instead of Y. But so for example, would you say the same thing for racial slurs, right? Like, would you say if a liberal gets upset because they hear a racial slur, even though they're not a member of that race?
I would consider it more like what Chaeiry brought up earlier with things like BIPOC or what was it, Latinx, where Latinx. Progressives were getting offended on behalf of these groups, and it turned out those groups they weren't actually offended and wanted things to go back.
Okay, so that's different. Yeah. So then there just becomes a question about whether trans people would be offended or not, whether it's a mistaken belief, rather than whether it's a genuine offense that they're being offended on behalf of a genuine offense. But they would say that it is a genuine offense and they're being offended on behalf of a genuine offense. When, if you were to say trans women are not women, right? If you were to say, then they would say,
hold on. I will challenge that, because I have been trying to put, I've only been trying to put these together for a short amount of time, but I've already run into several trans people who aren't even interested in debating the topic of trans identity, inclusive language. They're interested in other political topics. They just want to live their life. They're not offended by people being confused. I would say that there are a lot of them who are
no, certainly
they are white knighted in a way.
And I want to be clear, that is what I said as well, as I was talking about the fact that there's a progressive consensus on what they believe the trans consensus is, and that doesn't seem like that is actually the trans consensus.
Really
yeah.
Right. So then that's just an empirical question. So because we can ask the same empirical question for racial slurs. We can say okay, well, there's a liberal consensus on, whether this racial slur is actually offensive to this race. Whether it is, by and large, to the majority of that race is a separate question. I'm certainly aware of a lot of people on both, who would both, even for racial slurs, be like, okay, well, this is really offensive. There's a lot of people of a given race that would be like, okay, well, yeah, I don't really care.
Here, I can give you an example there. Which predates me joining this political space the last 2 years. There's always been a conversation in the Black community, the hip hop community specifically, about the use of the N-word. If you put it in your music, you have to understand who's going to be repeating it. You can't be shocked when you bring them on stage. I think Charlemagne was the first person to go under fire for saying, like, yeah, people, if you put it in your music, how am I going to tell them that they can't say it? And then from there, when I joined the political space, they seemed to think that all Black people were super offended by the N-word and could never even understand the justification for saying it in a song. So
I mean,
sometimes people...
I've talked about this a bunch as well. I grew up like in an all-Black neighborhood, went to an all-Black school. I grew up saying the N-word just like anybody else and had no idea early on that there was anything wrong with me saying it. I knew that it was a cuss word and that I wasn't supposed to say it around grown-ups, just like any other cuss word. Like at the time, it was no different. My girlfriends dated Black guys. They said the N-word. Like there was no difference to me until I moved to Georgia, and it was like yeah, go ahead.
Your girlfriends dated Black guys.
My sisters. Did I say girlfriends? My sisters.
Oh, okay. Your sister. I was going to say, because you're... Okay, go on.
Sorry.
Doing Adam 22 here?
Yeah, apparently.
Yeah.
But it can be both, whatever. But yeah, we grew up in that culture, and that was just what was normal to us, and until we moved to Georgia around all white people and found out very quickly that we were not supposed to say that. Other white people were very offended when we said it, and that changed fairly quickly. I think like the main argument seems to be that like rap and hip hop culture has done a really good job at like integrating Black culture with white culture and becoming more accepted within white culture. But parts of that Black culture is being put up on a pedestal, and then people want to be like those people that they praise and they idolize them. And then when they try to act like them and talk like them, then they get in trouble for it. And so it's like, yeah, you have to kind of pick and choose. Like either you be the idol and don't say it, or be the idol, say it, and then just be cool with everybody else saying it. But it's hard to say, like, yes, we want people to idolize us. We want people to accept our culture. But then when they do, we're going to pick and choose which parts they can actually engage in and which parts they can't engage in.
So getting back to how this ties into the principal point before, it's just, so it's the idea is that it's not any and all utility per se that counts for consideration. We're discounting disutility or maybe even utility that is resulting from some false belief or something like that. That's more of the view. It's like,
yeah,
okay, so if it's like a disutility that is resulting on like some offense on behalf of other people who are not, because they believe they're offended but they're not actually offended, then we're not going to have moral that at least not the same type of moral consideration. Whereas if the group of people actually were offended, by and large, right? I'm just rephrasing and just asking.
Yes, exactly. Yes, I think that is probably the more important part. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So then it would just, if that's the view, then it would by and large just be an empirical question. It's like we can look to. Maybe the way to resolve that would be to look to certain transgender surveys in terms of like how they feel about given words or whatnot. But it would be
to me, but it sounded like you were saying that you would actually include what progressives believe at large instead of just what the group believes.
Yeah, and the reason, well, it depends. So it would depend on whether, okay, so in a situation where, yeah, because in a situation where people are experiencing disutility as a result of a false belief, that to me is a different question. I agree, because then generally my approach would be to like, because here's the thing, like I happen to value truth, like not to the ends of the earth. Like if I had to sacrifice truth for or the world would be tortured, I would sacrifice truth, but. Once you add other considerations like, oh, well, this disutility is only coming because of false claims, you have another option of like, okay, well, maybe we can, just clarify that was a false claim. Maybe that we could just share the empirics, being like, oh, actually, you're all wrong. And maybe they'll be stubborn, maybe not. But that doesn't strike me as having, I tend to agree that doesn't strike me as having the same type of value, at least in terms of how I would adjudicate and try to adjust things based on if like, oh well, actually no, it's based on a completely true claim.
Yeah, of course.
I
Yeah,
took it-
well, I mean, that was more so what I was saying, is that if you're trying to be a representative of a group, but you're not actually representing that group, then how you feel about it, even though you're a much larger group, it doesn't really matter anymore, because your attempt is to be representative of the other group.
So my only point was that it's not just transgender individuals. Assuming transgender individuals are being affected by this term, and they are offended by this term, then to whatever degree they are, it would also be people who are taking offense on their behalf as well. That would also be under consideration.
Yeah. I suppose. I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know if that.
Like, it's true. To the degree, like, and I'm not
Sure,
admitting to whether it's true or not, but
even, but I would think that would only, I think that's the only thing that would actually matter, is whether or not it's true. Not whether or not, so if progressives are fighting for trans people, and progressives actually are a fair representation of trans people, I don't know that the harm that they face by representing trans people actually matters at all. It's only whether or not they're representing trans people truthfully, and whether or not that harm actually harms trans people. Because
so let's say they are. Let's say that there's a group of progressive individuals that are truthfully representing transgender individuals. They are offended on their behalf because they believe that there's transgender individuals that are hurt, and it turns out that they actually are hurt. And because they're hurt, they don't like seeing other people being hurt, and that causes them suffering as well. That my point is that sort of suffering would be included. I would take that into consideration as well. Like,
would you have room to take into consideration trans people being convinced that they are being hurt?
I'm sorry. So what's the question?
So having progressives basically take up a fight that isn't theirs, sort of mind read for a group of people that they don't belong to, is it possible that seeing so many people advocate for feelings hurt could convince a trans person that their feelings are hurt when maybe they did not care before?
So
like, I don't know how many people who do not care about women's sports have pretended that they care about women's sports.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
So is it, so the question is,
when we're trying to gauge how many people are affected by something, that sometimes advocacy pulls in people to have something to be upset about when before they weren't.
Oh yeah, no. Okay, so I agree that sort of thing happens. I just thought you were asking a question. But yeah, no.
Like, I'm basically asking if you consider that when you.
Oh sure.
When you gauge if that's happening.
I mean, look, there. Because here's the thing. So yes, I consider that as an issue, of course. There's always going to be some, look, we have an understanding that there are certain individuals who may not have the numbers to fight their own fights, at least politically, as effectively as if other people were to help them. That happens historically, that happens throughout, there's many examples of this. And so it's not inherently a bad thing if larger groups of people take up smaller groups of people's fights.
It's an aid, it's a help, yeah.
Yeah, it could be a very good thing. Of course, I also acknowledge that when that happens, there can be the people who are fighting on a given group's behalf may not actually be fighting on their behalf. They may be fighting on their own behalf and using the group as just, or what they think of the group as some justification.
I mean, Chaeiry's asking a bit of a different question, which
basically the chicken and the egg. How do you tell which one came first?
I think in the specific example that you gave, I don't think that you actually had to be a fan of women's sports in order to have a dog in the fight. And I think that this is something that people say a lot, like, oh, you didn't care about women's sports before until all of a sudden trans people were included. Because most of those people don't actually care about women's sports, and they'll tell you they don't care about women's sports. They care about fairness, right? When we're talking about like a group of socialists fighting for workers' rights at Wendy's, but none of them eat at Wendy's, we're not going to be like, oh, you didn't care about Wendy's before, did you? Well, no, because they cared about the workers' rights. They didn't actually care about Wendy's itself. And so this is what happens a lot is, yeah, people will say like, oh, you didn't care about this until X happened, but they didn't, they care about the fairness. They care about like, you know, whether or not people are actually getting what's deserved or whether or not this is right or wrong. And so I think in the end, like, it's still an okay thing for them to fight for and have a say in, and especially with things as wide ranging as like women's sports or bathrooms that are going to have a domino effect and have huge changes on culture. I think that people want to get in the fight early on and try to affect which direction it goes.
Yeah, so I agree with that. In terms of Chaeiry's question, in terms of how you tell if you're adequately representing a group, I think that's just an empirical question. I think what that would be, you know, collecting surveys from the group in question or asking them. It's not going to be that sort of exercise. And I also agree that, yeah. So
I don't know if it's that sort of exercise. I just want to. Maybe we can talk about this specific thing in another conversation, because I do think that we take concepts like poisoning the well and shit like that, and if, for me, it does come down to chicken or the egg. If there are a bunch of people already advocating, already saying that there's a group that is hurt by this, like, how can you tell if that has influenced their hurt or not?
Okay, so I see what you're saying now. So you're saying, maybe it's the fact that they have been okay. Yeah, that might be the case. There might be certain statistical ways of adjusting for that. There might be certain experimental procedures that can maybe adjust that factor out. But that would be more complicated of a procedure. But it's still an empirical question. In terms of what Tom was saying, so there's an interesting point here. So someone can actually take offense, not necessarily on behalf of a group, but they might still find certain things objectionable, even if the group doesn't find it objectionable. So I'm trying to think of an example where this happens. So, like, if we...
Let's say all black people tomorrow say they want to go back into slavery. I think a lot of people would think that there's something wrong with that, or that there's like an issue with consent, or like there's a moral issue there, regardless of what the group wants.
Right. So, yeah, so there's another point where it's like, well, even if it, you know, there might be certain cases where even if we're not representing the group's wishes, there might be cases where an argument can be made that there is reason for concern here. On their behalf. So that is another consideration.
Yeah, or like a bunch of minors want to have sex with adults or something. Like, yeah, we would say that like there's issues there. So lots of times what the group wants doesn't matter as much, because
addicts want heroin to be legalized.
Yeah. So we can kind of, if we already have like structures in place that tell us what is right or wrong ahead of time, we can go ahead and have an input on these things just based on some sort of ethical concern, regardless of what regardless of whether or not we feel like it's representative of the group.
Now, I want to be respectful of both of your times. I normally tell people that I will only keep you for an hour, but we were still going. If you guys would like to continue talking, I'm still going to be here. I only have to be ready for a show in an hour. But if you would like, you can summarize your statement, give yourself a shout out. And
I'm down to hang out for a while, one way or the other.
Yeah. So I don't know how much time.
Don't worry, Avi, you can ditch us.
But no. I think that I think we agree on most of the salient points here. Just in summary, if I could summarize it, I think there's multiple, in terms of how we use language, it's a broad scope, but the basic things I'm looking for is, first is coherency, then is whether it's a true or false statement, then is the utility of communication and other downstream effects. In terms of this culture war that we find ourselves in, I think most people are talking past each other on the descriptive propositions, because they're motivated by prescriptions. And I think a lot of it is semantics that, when explicated, there's no propositional disagreement. And really, it's just a difference in values and prescriptions that are motivating that failure to recognize that. And in terms of how I approach prescriptions, the answer is there's various different factors that weigh in. Some cases are easy, some cases are more complex. But there's a lot of it depends, and it's not necessarily one way or another way. And this is why language can be non-univocal, and for good reason. Why multiple words can mean multiple things in different contexts. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's in many cases a good thing. And I think if both sides of the aisle had this type of approach to language as it pertains to this issue, the transgender issues, I think there'd be a lot more productivity and a lot less of this culture war toxicity. So those are my thoughts on the matter. I'm Avi.
Where can people find you?
/AviMD. You can find me on Twitter at AviBittmd.
Cool.
And Tom?
I think I'd want to get your thoughts on my
give
document
yourself
if Avi, if you're open to it.
Feel free to shoot it to me in Discord.
But
Cool.
Tom, before he goes, you should summarize your position and stuff.
Yeah, I generally think that the way that we think about things colloquially may be different than the way that we act in practice. So lots of times when I'm talking about the way that things work out linguistically, when it comes to how I interact with somebody on an individual level, most of the time I'm just going to go for their own personal comfort and try to make that person happy, even if that is different from what I perceive a word to mean. Because as long as I don't see any sort of harm coming from it or any sort of confusion coming from it, I'm normally going to try to appease the person and make them happy. I think that language is an important part of our culture, and it shapes culture, and it shapes the way that we think about things. And I think that both sides, as I said before, are being very prescriptive, but they're not actually engaging with the other side a lot of times. If you go to a dictionary, it will have both definitions in it. Like, every single time it will have both definitions. And so Avi and I obviously agree that both definitions are valid and both definitions are going to be used in either context. And I think that lots of times people disregard that when they're talking about what is a woman. And so I think that, yeah, if you actually look into the science of things, if you look into the linguistics of things, if you look into like what the authorities say about a lot of these subjects and engage with that instead of having some sort of political motivation first and then looking at the authorities later, generally you'll come to a better conclusion. But yeah.
And where can people find you?
Tomfoolery Show. I'm on YouTube, youtube.com/Tomfoolery Show. I'm also on Kick and Twitch, but don't really stream there very often anymore. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for both coming. And that's basically just going to be my outro. Okay.
Cool.
Avi, if you want to head out, thanks so much.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Avi. Have a good one.
See ya.
Yeah,
Tom,
sorry, maybe I was a little confused coming in. The way that the messages went, I thought that he had an issue with what I was saying for the panel, and so I thought that he wanted to talk about that instead.
I think it was like splitting hairs kind of thing, but I think that's more interesting to him to have a conversation with someone that he mostly agrees with.
For sure.
And I think there's a lot of people that I've reached out to or have reached out to me that are way more interested in these kinds of conversations, not specifically about gender inclusivity, but just like in general, talking to somebody that they mostly agree with and maybe split hairs on like a couple things.
Yeah. I think it's cool that you're doing panels, actually. I think that you'll do really well with that.
You.
I've always enjoyed like the way that you went into debates where you had like your notes and everything and just kind of said like, I've got a list of questions and I just want to kind of push through these, and you would stop on one for a while and just kind of grill them on it.
Call people poor and mall cop?
Well,
Okay,
I messaged you after like the President's Sunday conversation and said that I really enjoyed that, and I thought you did a really good job there. And I feel like there was another one similar to that where you did the same thing, just went in with a bunch of notes and were like, hey, I just want to ask you a bunch of questions. And so yeah, I enjoyed that. And so if you're asking a bunch of questions on panels as well and like taking notes during those things, I think that that'll make it really good.
Thank you. That's the plan. Could I get you to entertain chat for a bit? Because I want to go take my vitamins and make another cup of coffee.
Yeah, sure. I'm here for it.
A bunch of people been messaging me saying that Tom is fair, so I don't know what's going on there. But when I get back, can you explain it?
Sure. I saw a bunch of people, so everybody in my chat got it, but I was watching Chaeiry's chat the entire time, and I saw that a bunch of you guys were confused when I said that I was going to eat my dog, because everybody in my chat kept telling me to, like, say something about veganism because Dr. Avi is a vegan. And so they kept saying, they're like, say something about eating meat, say something about veganism. So when he said that when he said that, you know, if you found out your dog died, but it didn't really die, like you might be hurt by the fact that you think your dog died, when in reality, it didn't actually die. And I said, well, if I thought my dog died, I would have eaten it already, and so I would be pretty sure that it's dead. So yeah, that I saw everybody was a little bit confused by that one, but that it was just a joke about veganism. Tom, tell them the poop story? No, I'm not doing that. Yasmin, you and Lou are literally the same person. Just one of you is trans and one of you is gay, okay? There's no reason for the two of you to ever be around one another. You guys are already too much with one of you. To have both of you on at the same time would be obnoxious. Tom, do this IRL. Do what Charmander's doing. Chaeiry's still hosting the panel with Destiny. Yeah, they're supposed to go on at 6. Tom, Yasmin was fighting with Abaddon. No. Yasmin fighting with somebody? No shot. I said me and Abaddon? Oh. I'd probably throw Abaddon into that bucket as well, actually. Yeah, all the gay guys look alike to me. We reviewed Brittany Simon's video the other day talking about like relationships and Abba and Preach. My editor Contrast is turning that into a video right now. But she commented on the live and said that she wanted to talk about it sometime. So we might be setting up a conversation soon with Brittany Simon to talk about prioritizing certain things in relationships. Because for her, it was either you get what you want or you're settling. And it's just one of those two things. And she's like, if you don't get exactly what you want, then you're settling. So you should always try to get exactly what you want in every single aspect of a relationship. And I was going off on stream like, this is ridiculous. You can't, like, you're always prioritizing. You're always getting some things that you want more of and not other things that you want. Like, otherwise, everybody, like, every girl would be with a freaking billionaire that looks like, I don't know,
I'm back.
Tom Cruise or something.
Tom Cruise is what, a woman's ideal?
I guess. I was trying to think of somebody else, but I couldn't remember the name. What's
Denzel Washington.
Okay, Denzel Washington's a good one. I was trying to think. Brad Pitt. That's who I was trying to think of. Brad Pitt.